What's up, YouTube? It's your boy GP's on the keys, and it's too easy. We're back with another video today, and we're just continuing with these World War I and World War II series because you guys are really enjoying these, and you know what I'm saying. I am definitely having a good time watching these. Like, I'm enjoying the content. You know what I'm saying. It's the best when I enjoy the content and you guys like it too. So, without further ado, geez, I'm a rapper, bro. I'm a rapper out here in these streets. It's like, nah, let me stop. Eastern Front of World War II, animated 1943 to 1944. This is like near the middle to like the tail end of the war. Like, just a whole bunch of stuff just unfolds. So let's just watch.
In the last months of 1942, the German forces were encircled at Stalingrad. At first, the Germans hoped to reverse the situation by relieving the pocket and maintaining it by air supply. However, as 1943 began, the Germans were forced to abandon their plans to relieve the city and were pushed back from its approaches. Despite that, they ordered their troops in Stalingrad to hold out as long as possible in order to tie up Soviet units and buy time. The advance of the Red Army created the possibility of the German troops in the Caucasus to be cut off. They ordered a full withdrawal from the region while their forces in the north kept the path of retreat open. The main effort of the Red Army was, however, directed against the Hungarian and Italian units on the northern flank. Their lightly equipped forces were unable to hold the line and were forced into a harsh winter retreat. Most of them lost their combat capabilities or were destroyed, leaving a large gap in the Axis lines. The German units in the north had also to retreat, but they were able to keep their battle worthiness intact. At the same time, the Germans managed to pull back part of their forces from the Caucasus. The remaining troops formed a breachhead on the coast to retain the opportunity for a summer push towards the oil fields. During January, both sides had their full attention set on the southern sector. The lack of the German reserves allowed the Red Army to achieve two small but significant victories. They re-established a land connection to Leningrad, and in the central part of the front, they captured the railway junction of Veliki Luki. For the Axis, the situation in the south continued to deteriorate. The German troops in Stalingrad surrendered, freeing up significant numbers of Soviet units.
I know I didn't say anything for a while. I was really paying attention, but just think of how it is. You're really surrounded on all sides by the enemy. They held out for a minute too, so you got to give them credit for their resolve, because they held out despite being surrounded on every side. Like, I couldn't even imagine that, just being like everywhere you look, it's your enemy.
The Red Army forces moving west into the Ukraine were not very formidable, but the large gap in the Axis line left them little opposition. The Soviet command decided to exploit this opportunity and attempted to cut off almost all of the army group south.
Look at the Soviets pushing back. Finally, they're finally pushing back, because Germany has been kicking their butts the entire time, and now they're finally starting to get an advantage, starting to push them back. Like, because the first two videos, it was just Soviets kept getting pushed back. Soviets kept getting pushed back. They fight back for a little bit, then they push back like here. I guess Soviets, they slowly gaining ground. Okay.
In response, the Germans used the forces retreating from the Caucasus to extend their front eastwards and pull their main force west. The Red Army moved further west to bypass their line and encircle them, but this overextended their forces. The Germans counterattacked from two sides and disorganized their forward detachments. Having caught the Soviet southern flank off balance, the Germans now wanted to push in both from north and south at the same time, destroying the whole Soviet force. They began to muster their units for the northern attack. In the south, their troops continued onwards, retaking Kharkov. But in the north, they failed to concentrate a force sufficient for the attack, though they were able to stop the Red Army's advance. By this time, both the Soviets and the Germans had exhausted their forces and went on defensive. As the fighting in the south had drawn all German reinforcements, the Red Army prepared to launch a major offensive in the north and center. The Germans realized the danger and responded by abandoning their most vulnerable positions before the Soviets had finished deployment, and the attacks that took place failed to achieve their goals. Being confronted with a much
Germany's starting to take a little bit more L's now. They starting to take some more L's. They losing that land a little bit. It's not looking too good.
stronger German line, the Red Army abandoned its offensive plans and the Eastern Front became quiet. With the end of the winter campaign, the Axis had lost the capabilities necessary to knock the Soviet Union out of the war by capturing the areas vital for its war effort. Now they planned to win through attrition by holding on to the occupied areas and inflicting vast casualties to the attacking Red Army. In this way, they could drain the areas remaining under the Soviet control, dry up resources, and create a stalemate. The Red Army, on the other hand, set out to take back the economically vital western lands of the Soviet Union, which would give it a strategic advantage. However, this time they would play it safe. Their previous offensives had been threatened by the German armored counterattacks, and this time they decided to receive them on prepared defenses. At the same time with building up the fortifications, the Red Army formed a massive offensive force. As part of their defense strategy, the Germans planned a number of limited offensives to encircle Soviet forces and shorten their defensive line. The most promising of these was the encirclement of the Soviet units in the Kursk salient. It took 3 months for the German build-up to match the gradually improved Soviet defenses, and
Did you see the Soviets had over 6.5 million just on that one front line? And that was double. Like 6.5 million men.
in the beginning of July, they launched their attack. The Germans made some headway, but were ultimately stopped dead in the depth of the Soviet defenses. Having for the time tied up the strongest German armored units, the Red Army now released its forces for the offensive. The attacks were to be carried out in consecutive stages along several sectors of the front. First, the Red Army struck into the rear of the German troops north of Kursk. Being unable to contain the attack and wishing to avoid the danger of encirclement, the Germans began the process of evacuating the salient. At the same time,
That's great. Wow. So now so first you start out in 41. You start out. You push them all the way to daggone near Moscow, like Moscow past Stalingrad, and now you're retreating. Now you're running back. The irony, karma. So, wow. I mean, but the thing is, that would have took that. You gotta imagine how much that would have took to overtake the entire Soviet Union. Just think about how big the Soviet Union is. The Soviet Union, it was like 10 times the size of Germany. You could fit like 10 Germanys inside one Russia. Like, just think about how much land mass you would have had to overcome in order to even get an advantage, to get a real sizable advantage. And then obviously the population is going to be miles ahead of yours, so you're going to always have more soldiers, more bodies ready to throw at you.
time, the Red Army launched an attack in the south. The Germans redeployed their forces and contained it. By this time, the Soviet units south of Kursk had finished reorganization and pushed towards Kharkov. The Germans redeployed their forces to the sector but failed to hold the city, though succeeded in temporarily containing the Soviet advance. The situation in the north was more under the German control. The Red Army failed to break through the German defenses near Smolensk. At the same time, the Germans had finished their withdrawal to the new line, strengthening their positions further. By this time, the Germans had been able to maintain the balance and check the Red Army's attacks. However, the renewal of the Soviet offensive near the sea broke the German line and forced them into a large-scale retreat. Even more, the concurrent offensive against the lightly fortified German positions on the former western edge of the Kursk salient resulted in a breakthrough the Germans weren't able to contain. They now realized that they lacked the troops necessary to contain the Soviets in their present line and ordered a retreat to a much better defendable Panther wartime position that was...
It was like that in the beginning. They should have known. They should obviously they did gain it. They did catch them by surprise by doing it. But you should have, bro. It would have took a lot of luck in your favor to overtake the entire country of Russia. I know it's not Russia back then. I just want to say Russia because I don't want to keep saying Soviet Union. So you knew, and you back in your mind, you knew you didn't have enough men. You knew you probably didn't have enough resources, because obviously this was not going to be some little we're going to take maybe a year and a half at the most, and then we're just going to overtake Russia. No, come on. you gotta really, obviously they had high goals back then, and now it's like, oh, I'm sure Hitler felt invincible at this point. He felt invincible now because he basically was a world renowned dictator. Like, everybody knew who he was. So obviously his confidence had to be on level 9,000. But I feel like this was kind of like, I understand the move, but like it was I think it might have been doomed from the start, because obviously they did gain ground, but it would have taken a lot of Soviet deaths, like a lot more Soviet deaths. Like the Germans, like they had to have they would have had to go through a lot of Russians to be able to overtake Russia, and it's a lot of Russians.
Centered around the Dnieper River and its tributaries. At the same time, the Soviet breakthrough near Smolensk hastened the retreat of Army Group Center. With the German forces taking a stronger defensive position, the Red Army had to concentrate its main effort on a shorter section of the front. They decided to make regaining western Ukraine the main priority. First, however, we'll take a look at the central part of the front, where the Red Army had outrun the Germans to the Dnieper and had established a breachhead on the junctions of the Army Group Center and South. They planned to trap the whole Army Group Center by combined strikes from the breachhead and from a breakthrough in the north, while the other forces would pin the Germans in place. In October, while part of the Red Army was still recovering from the pursuit, battles were fought in order to secure the breachhead. Meanwhile, the other forces began creating a breach in the northern part of the front. With their main focus being in the south, the Red Army had established several breachheads over the Dnieper in Ukraine. After they had got their heavy equipment over the river, they attempted local breakouts, first of which took place in the south. The Germans were able to contain it. Then the Soviets broke through the
I don't know why I've never asked what those numbers represent. My best guess is those numbers are like the divisions in the army. So I guess like this right here is like the 57th division of the German army, or like the 34th, the 33rd division. I mean, that's my best guess. I probably might be wrong, but if somebody, you know what I'm saying, if I'm wrong, you know what I'm saying, somebody could correct me, you know what I'm saying. But that's my best guess right now, because I've been looking at those numbers. I'm trying to think, like, what are those numbers?
German land front, severing their connection with the Crimea. They proceeded with another breakout attempt near Kiev, but the Germans redeployed their troops and pushed it back towards the river. Having not fully succeeded in the breakouts, the Red Army adopted a more systematic approach, slowly but surely expanding its breachheads and massing troops for a larger breakout. In the center, the Red Army was now better prepared, which allowed it to increase the pressure. It resulted in a breakthrough in the north. The Germans held on to the flanks in the hopes of conducting a counterattack and cutting the Soviet forces off. Then the Soviets launched their main attack from the southern breachhead. It broke through the lines and gained limited success, though it failed to achieve its objective. The Germans were able to prevent a deeper breakthrough by abandoning territory and pulling back their front line. As 1943 ended, the Red Army was ready for the winter offensive, which would encompass the whole Soviet-German front. In Ukraine, the Germans had concentrated their defenses in the Great Bend of the Dnieper. This allowed the Red Army to catch them off balance by mounting a breakout from the Kiev breachhead. The Germans managed to contain their advance only with great difficulties. They wanted to keep their last position near the Dnieper River as a staging area for a possible counterattack and did not evacuate it despite the evident threat. The Red Army exploited this by cutting the salient off with a two-pronged attack. The Germans launched a rescue attempt and were able to retrieve part of the encircled forces, but without their heavy equipment. With the German attention directed towards the pocket, the Soviet forces launched attacks on the flanks, threatening to sever the connection between the army groups south and center.
They moving in fast. Okay, go ahead.
Meanwhile, Soviet troops were continuing with their attempt to encircle Army Group Center itself. In the north, the Germans realized they lacked the force to cut off the Red Army's breakthrough and abandoned the exposed salients. The Red Army now attempted to encircle the town of Vitebsk, but it was not met with success. Most of the Red Army's offensive assets were deployed in the south, and as a result, the goals of the Soviet forces in the center proved to be beyond the means to achieve them. The offensives took limited territory at the price of large casualties and were eventually abandoned. During the summer, the Soviet pressure on the Army Group North had not been as strong as against the other army groups, and the Germans had dispatched a lot of its strength to other fronts. Despite its greatly reduced strength, the army group had not withdrawn to the shorter line and still held its forward positions. The Red Army attempted to encircle part of the German forces during the winter offensive. The Germans evaded the encirclement and then attempted to resist on the new positions, but they lacked the strength to do so, and it was decided to withdraw to the Panther Line. Both armies settled on the new line, and during the remaining part of the winter, the Red Army undertook only some limited attacks in order to probe the German defenses. The Red Army was planning to achieve its main success in the south. During the preceding half-year, the Soviet forces were slowly but steadily consolidating their positions on the west bank of the Dnieper, and by the beginning of March, this process was complete. The German Army Group South was by then pushed into the open plains and did not retreat behind any other natural obstacle, leaving it vulnerable. The Soviets wanted to pin the whole army group to the Carpathian Mountains or the Black Sea and destroy it. The Axis were unable to resist the Soviet tank armies, and the whole front fell back. Near the Black Sea, they began pulling back their forces, but in the west, the Red Army encircled several German corps.
They started moving in like, whoa, okay, go ahead. I'm like, bro, this is, you know what I'm saying? They finally fought back, and when they fought back hard.
The Soviets made the mistake by expecting the Germans to retreat southwards, which allowed them to extract most of the trapped force back to their front lines. Then the Red Army captured the Crimea as the last operation of the winter campaign. The Soviet Union had taken back its most economically valuable lands and gained the resources it needed to defeat Germany completely. However, with the front being still more close to Moscow than Berlin, the question was, how long shall it take? The Germans, meanwhile, had other problems to deal with. The Western Allies had landed in Italy and were preparing to do the same in France. The race to Berlin was on.
But yeah, definitely, I see how this episode, the Soviets finally started fighting back, and when they fought back, they pushed Germany. Whoa! They said you're not coming back, and we're gonna make sure of it. Like they, boom, boom, boom. Line kept moving back. Line kept moving back. Line kept like I just like this whole. Like, this whole thing is just, I don't know, this is just so interesting for some reason. I don't know why, I don't know what it is. It's just interesting just to visualize the stories in your mind, just all the, visualize like the fighting, like just the atmosphere. You know what I mean? I'm not saying in a positive light, but just the fact that it was what it was. Like it was the fact that there was a war, and the fact that like just the Soviets were really crushing in on them after they had just been pummeled for like 2 straight years. Like this, it's just I don't know. I can't really describe it. I don't know why. But anyway, thank you again for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you are new to the channel. Don't forget to share the video wherever you share videos at. Also, don't forget to turn on my post notifications so that you don't miss an upload. But anyways, please be safe during this quarantine. Have a great day. Stay on the grind. I'm out. Peace.